They saw it before they heard it. The arc of rawhide cutting the air toward a woman holding her baby. The evening sun spilled gold over the main street of Dry Creek, the kind of light that turned dust into copper and shadows into deep, soft pools. Heat shimmered above the hard-packed earth, and the smell of horse, leather, and wood smoke clung to the air. Folks lingered on their porches the way they always did near supper time, eyes tracking every wagon, every rider, every scrap of movement, as if the street itself was a stage and trouble the only performance worth watching. Ellie Kane stood outside the general store, her infant son tucked against her chest, feeling the weight of both child and gaze. At 22, she carried her strength plainly, broad-shouldered, steady on her feet, with hands that knew work and a heart that knew kindness. But in Dry Creek, folks measured a woman like her first by size, then by what use they thought she might serve. Ellie had long since learned to stand quiet under it, folding herself into smaller shapes without disappearing. The store's door banged open behind her. Will Kane stepped out, the coil of rawhide in his hand catching the sunlight like a serpent waking. He didn't look at Ellie so much as through her, his voice pitched to carry across the street to every listening ear. "You shame me," he said, the words sharp as glass. "You make me a beggar before men." Ellie lifted the baby higher, tucking his head under her chin. "We're nearly out of flour," she answered, calm and low. "Micah will be hungry in the morning." Will's smile was a thin, dangerous thing. "Micah will be fed," he said, "and you will remember your place." The rawhide looped tighter in his hand. Somewhere nearby, a chair scraped against a porch. Someone's rocking stopped mid-swing. The street leaned in. The first crack of leather split the evening air. It caught her sleeve and startled the baby into a sharp, panicked cry. Ellie rocked him gently, refusing to flinch, heat crawling beneath her skin less from the blow than from the eyes watching. The town's stillness was its own verdict. No one moved, no one spoke. From the far end of the street, hoofbeats slowed. A tall rider swung down from a black gelding, the braid in his dark hair catching the last threads of sunlight. He tied his horse with unhurried ease and began walking toward them, gaze level, step steady. Close now, his face showed the lines of weather and miles, but his posture carried the quiet watchfulness of a man who had learned patience in hard country. Will drew back the whip again. This time the stranger's hand rose, catching the leather mid-swing. The rawhide sagged between them like a snake caught just behind the head. For a heartbeat, the street forgot to breathe. "You teach by hurting," the man said, his voice calm but certain. "I choose to stop you." The words hung there in the hot air, heavier than the dust, heavier than the silence. If you love tales of grit, redemption, and love that lasts, subscribe to Dust and Destiny now, and ride with us to the very end. By the time the last light slipped behind the cottonwoods, Ellie was home, moving through the small kitchen with Micah balanced on her hip. The fire in the stove was low, just enough to warm the room, and the smell of simmering beans hung in the air. Micah's soft breathing against her shoulder was the one steady sound in a house that otherwise felt taut, as though the walls themselves were holding their breath. Will had come in late, dust and whiskey clinging to him, and sat at the table without a word. He ate quickly, jaw working hard, his eyes never quite meeting hers. Ellie had learned to read the quiet. Will's silences could be heavier than his words, and they often came before something worse. She cleared the dishes, careful not to break the fragile stillness, but she could feel his temper smoldering just beneath the surface. The next morning, she wrapped Micah in the patched quilt and walked to the public well. The air was sharp with early autumn, crisp enough to sting her cheeks. As she set the bucket on the worn boards and began winding the rope, a shadow fell across the well. She looked up to see the tall Apache rider, Talon Red Elk, standing opposite her, his hands empty, his eyes steady. Without a word, he reached for the rope, drawing the bucket up in one smooth motion. The water barely rippled when it reached the top. "Thank you," Ellie said, her voice quieter than she meant it to be. Talon nodded once, glancing at the red impressions the rope had left on her palms. "Your hands are marked," he said. "They'll fade," she replied. His gaze shifted briefly toward her sleeve before returning to her face. "Fading doesn't mean forgotten." A day later, she crossed paths with him again on the road. Micah slept in her arms, his small head tucked under her chin as Talon approached on horseback. He slowed to match her pace, never crowding, his presence more like a shadow that simply kept the sun off her back. When a wagon rattled by, spraying dust toward her, he guided his horse between her and the road without a word. By the time they reached her gate, the dust had settled. "The wind will turn cold tonight," he said. "Keep your child near the fire." It wasn't long before the whispers started. Widow Campbell, wrapped in her ever-present shawl, stopped Ellie outside the post office. "I hear you've had company," she said, her tone coated in the kind of sweetness that carried splinters. "That Apache fellow's been seen near your place more than once." Ellie adjusted Micah's blanket and met the woman's gaze. "The well is public," she said. "Some people draw water without malice." The widow's smile thinned, but her eyes shone with the satisfaction of having baited the hook. That evening, Will came through the door with a look that made Ellie's stomach knot. "I hear talk," he said, tossing his hat onto the table. "About you, about him." He didn't have to say Talon's name. The venom in his voice made it plain. "If you can't remember your place," he went on, "maybe my sister will keep the boy for a while, until you do." Ellie's arms tightened around Micah. "You won't," she said, but her voice came out softer than she intended. Will smiled, not kindly. "I will, and if you fight me, you'll wish you hadn't." He poured himself a drink, as if the conversation were finished. The next morning, as she hung laundry on the line, Talon appeared at the edge of the yard. His stride was unhurried, but his eyes searched hers the moment they met. "He means to take something from you," Talon said. "He means to take my child," Ellie answered, the words tasting like iron. Talon's gaze was steady. "If trouble comes, light the lamp in your east window, I will see it." She wanted to ask why he would risk himself for someone he barely knew, but the question stuck in her throat. Instead, she nodded once. That night, as she laid Micah in his cradle, she looked at the east window, the small oil lamp on the sill. She ran her hand over the glass chimney, feeling the cool smoothness. It was a simple thing, a bit of light in the dark, but to her it had become something more, a promise she could call upon if the moment came. And for the first time since she could remember, Ellie knew one thing with certainty. She would not yield quietly again. The days that followed settled into a rhythm that wasn't quite peaceful, but predictable enough for Ellie to catch her breath. She still rose before dawn, lit the stove, and rocked Micah back to sleep before the light broke over Dry Creek. But there was something new threaded through her mornings now, a steady awareness that somewhere out there, Talon Red Elk might be watching the same sky, riding the same stretch of road, moving in that quiet, deliberate way of his. One morning, as she drew water from the well, she saw him again. The air was cold enough to sting her fingertips, and the rope bit into her palms as she pulled the bucket upward. Without a word, Talon stepped in, his hands closing over the line. The weight of the full bucket seemed like nothing to him, and he set it down as gently as if it were a child. His gaze dropped to her hands, and he studied the faint ridges left by the rope. "Your hands," he said, his voice low, "have taken too much weight." "They've carried worse," she replied. She meant it to sound casual, but something in his expression told her he'd heard the truth beneath it. He didn't press her further. Another afternoon, they met on the road as she walked back from the mercantile. Micah was asleep in her arms, his small hand tangled in the edge of her shawl. Talon's horse slowed to match her pace, the animal's breath puffing white in the cool air. When a rider came too fast around the bend, splashing mud toward her skirts, Talon moved his horse between them in one fluid motion, taking the spray on his own boots. He didn't look at her when it happened, didn't make it into a gesture to be thanked, just returned to her side as though nothing had occurred. They spoke little in these encounters, but their silences were not empty. She began to notice how he measured distance, not too close, never crowding, but near enough that she felt shielded. She noticed the way his eyes seemed to take in more than what was in front of him, as though he were reading the air for signs only he could see. That night, as she sat by the fire, Ellie's mind drifted to a memory she hadn't touched in years. She was a girl again, barely tall enough to reach the top of her mother's kitchen table, standing at the back door while the wind howled across the plains. Her mother had pointed to the cottonwoods swaying outside, their long branches bending but never breaking. "That's how you stand when the wind comes hard," she'd said. "You don't fight it head on. You give a little and you keep your roots deep." Ellie had learned to live that way, bending under Will's moods, bending under the town's stares, but never quite breaking. Yet lately, she felt something else rising in her, something less willing to bend. She wondered if her mother would have called that strength, or just a new kind of wind. She didn't know that Talon carried a memory of her, too. Years before, at a trading post miles north of Dry Creek, he had seen a teenage girl standing beside a wagon holding a sack of flour that seemed nearly half her size. Her cheeks were flushed from the cold, her hair pulled back, and she was watching the road as though it might give her an answer. He hadn't spoken to her then, but the sight had stayed with him. A small, bright image filed away among the many faces he'd passed on his long road. When he saw her again outside the general store weeks ago, whip raised against her, the recognition had struck sharp as lightning. The next morning, Ellie opened her front door to find something resting on the porch. The sun had not yet climbed high, and the boards were still cool under her bare feet. There, wrapped in a square of plain cloth, was a single baby moccasin. It was small, finely stitched from soft deerskin, the kind of care in the handiwork that only came from someone who meant it. She picked it up, running her fingers over the smooth seams, the faint scent of leather rising in the cool air. There was no note, no need for one. She knew who had left it. Ellie stood there for a moment, the moccasin cupped in her hand, the morning light spilling across the yard. Micah stirred in his cradle behind her, and she turned back into the house, tucking the gift away in the drawer beneath the flour sack. Hidden, but not denied. 3 nights passed before Will came home late, the smell of whiskey and sweat drifting in with him. Mud clung to his boots in thick ridges. Ellie was at the table, mending the hem of Micah's blanket. Will's eyes swept the room the way a man might scan for trespassers, and then they landed on the small drawer under the counter. He pulled it open without asking, the wood scraping loud in the quiet. When his hand came back up, the baby's moccasin rested in his palm. He turned it over, thumb pressing into the soft leather. "What's this?" he asked, his voice flat in a way that made it more dangerous. "A gift," Ellie said, keeping her voice steady. "From him," Will said. It wasn't a question. The flicker in his eyes was part jealousy, part something uglier. "Do you take me for the fool?" "I take you for a man who knows when he's being cruel," she said evenly, "and who sees when someone else is kind." Will's jaw worked, the moccasin twisting in his grip. "You're making me a joke." "You're making yourself one," she replied. The words hung there between them like a plank laid over a ravine. For a moment she thought he might cross the space and strike her, but his gaze slid to Micah, who was watching from his cradle, wide-eyed. Will set the moccasin down on the table with a sharp tap. "Remember your place," he said, and stepped outside, the door closing with a tired thud. The following afternoon, Ellie saw Talon again at the well. She was ready to draw water, but he was already there, the rope wound around his hands, the bucket half raised. He didn't hand it over immediately. Instead, he looked at her with a kind of searching in his eyes, as if weighing whether she would turn away. "Your husband found it," she said simply. Talon nodded once, no surprise in his face. "He will turn it into a weapon if he can. Not the kind you hold. One made of shame." Ellie studied him for a moment. "Why did you make it?" "Because I know what it is to be small in someone else's story," he said. His gaze was steady, but there was a shadow in it now, the weight of something old. "My father was Anglo, my mother was Apache. To her people I was marked by his blood. To his people I was marked by hers. I've been a stranger everywhere I've stood. You learn to walk through both worlds, but you never belong to either." The wind shifted, bringing the faint scent of rain. Ellie felt the truth of his words settle into her like stones. "I used to think strength meant keeping quiet," she said after a moment. standing still so no one could see the cracks. She looked toward the cottonwoods at the edge of town. But maybe it's speaking when someone wants you silent. Maybe it's refusing to step back when they expect you to. Talon's eyes followed hers to the trees, their branches swaying gently. "The river forgets its banks after a flood," he said, "but the land remembers." Ellie let the words rest between them. She thought of her mother's voice teaching her to bend like those cottonwoods without breaking, and she realized she had misunderstood part of it. Sometimes, standing meant more than just surviving the wind. Sometimes it meant holding your ground so the wind couldn't carry you away at all. They didn't speak for a while after that. The water in the bucket barely trembled as he set it down on the boards. She dipped her pail into it, filling the tin basin. When she looked up, Talon was watching her. Not in the way men in town did, measuring or weighing, but as though he were checking that she still stood where she chose to stand. "Thank you," she said. He gave a small nod, his expression unreadable. "For now." She carried the water home, feeling the quiet between them like a bridge that had been built plank by plank. They would not cross it often, but it was there all the same. Boundaries remained. He would not step into her house without being asked, and she would not seek him out without cause. But respect had rooted itself deep, and it would hold through whatever storms came next. It was near dusk when Ellie heard the soft clop of hooves outside. The light through the kitchen window had taken on that deep amber tone that made the dust in the air seem almost golden. She stepped to the doorway, Micah balanced on her hip, and saw Talon dismounting in the yard. He carried something small in one hand, wrapped in a strip of cloth. He didn't come all the way to the porch, just far enough that she could see the faint curve of a smile at the edge of his mouth. "For when he walks," Talon said, unwrapping the bundle. Inside was a second baby moccasin, slightly larger than the first, stitched along the edges with a single line of red thread. Ellie took it in her free hand, the leather warm from where it had rested in his palm. The red stitching caught the fading sunlight, a quiet brightness against the pale hide. "It matches the first," she said, brushing her thumb along the seam. "They should be together," Talon replied. "One for each step he'll take." For a moment, she considered slipping it into the drawer beside the other, hidden away from Will's eyes and the town's gossip. But she closed her fingers around it instead, meeting Talon's gaze. "I'll keep them where he can see them," she said. Talon's eyes softened just enough to register approval. "Then he'll remember someone made them for his steps before he could take them." Ellie nodded, and for the first time in a long while, she felt the absence of fear. Not because the world had grown safer, but because she knew she could face it as she was. "Safety isn't the absence of danger," she said, the words forming as naturally as breath. "It's knowing I'll meet it standing." Neither of them spoke after that. Talon tipped his head once in acknowledgement, then turned to mount his horse. She watched him ride back toward the road, his silhouette framed against the last flare of daylight before it slipped away. Inside, the house felt different. She set Micah in his cradle, his dark eyes following her every movement, then reached into the drawer for the first moccasin. She placed them together on the narrow shelf above the hearth, the red stitching of the new one bright against the warm glow of firelight. They were small things, barely larger than her palm, but they stood for something bigger, proof that kindness could come without strings, and that she no longer needed to hide what strengthened her. The moccasins became part of the room, as unmissable as the stove or the rocking chair, a quiet declaration to anyone who entered that her worth was not something to be concealed. That night, as she stirred the stew and listened to Micah's soft coos from the cradle, her eyes drifted often to the shelf. The sight of the two moccasins side by side settled something inside her. They were more than gifts. They were a marker of the ground she'd chosen to stand on, a reminder that she had not been entirely alone in the choosing. When the wind picked up outside, rattling the shutters, she thought again of the cottonwoods her mother had taught her to watch, how they bent without breaking, how their roots held fast through every season. She realized then that she had not only bent, she had also begun to grow. The firelight danced on the red thread, making it seem almost alive. And in that small, steady glow, Ellie knew she had claimed something for herself, something no one, not even Will, could take back. It started with the way Will moved through the house, more swagger in his step, more satisfaction in the curl of his smile. Ellie recognized it for what it was, a man with a plan he believed couldn't fail. He spoke little, but when he did, his words carried an edge that made her skin prickle. By the third morning, he told her plainly. "Tomorrow," he said, leaning against the doorframe while she spooned porridge into Micah's bowl. "You and the boy will come to town with me. Folks have been talking, I'll quiet it, and you'll stand beside me while I do." His tone wasn't a request, it was a summons. Ellie's first instinct was to refuse, but she swallowed it. Not out of fear, out of calculation. There was no stopping him from going through with it, but she could choose how she would meet it. That night, after she laid Micah in his cradle, she stood by the east window, fingers brushing the unlit lamp. She didn't think she'd need to light it, but the knowledge that she could if the moment turned dangerous was a steadying weight in her mind. The next day dawned brittle and bright, the kind of day where the sunlight seemed to sharpen every shadow. Will was dressed neat, his boots polished, his hair slicked back. He made sure Ellie's dress was plain and serviceable, nothing to suggest she had dressed for her own purposes. Micah was bundled in his quilt, his dark eyes peeking out from under the brim of her bonnet. By the time they reached the square, half the town seemed to have gathered. The blacksmith leaned in his doorway, apron dusted with filings. Widow Campbell sat prim as a pin on the bench outside the post office, her knitting needles clicking like tiny hammers. The sheriff was there too, leaning on the railing outside the saloon, hat low, eyes watchful. Will led her to the center, planting his boots wide. "My wife," he said, turning so the crowd could see them both, "has been keeping company she ought not keep. A man who thinks he can step between a husband and his home." His voice carried easily, each word calculated to feed the town's hunger for spectacle. Ellie kept her chin level, her gaze fixed just over the heads of the crowd. Micah shifted against her chest, sensing the tension in the air. "You've forgotten yourself," Will said, his tone rising just enough for everyone to lean in. "Forgotten your vows, and now before God and these witnesses." The rest was swallowed by the sound of hoofbeats. Slow, deliberate, unhurried, they came from the far end of the street. Heads turned. A black gelding appeared, Talon red elk in the saddle. He didn't rush. Each step of his horse was measured, a pace that said he chose the time and no one else. He dismounted at the edge of the square, tying the reins loosely to the hitching post. His gaze never left Will. The crowd shifted, murmurs running through them like wind through grass. "I told you before," Talon said as he walked forward, voice low but carrying. "No man harms a mother before my eyes." Will let out a short, sharp laugh. "You think you can tell me how to keep my house?" Talon's expression didn't change. "I think your house has no wall strong enough to hide what you do." The tension tightened like a rope pulled from both ends. The sheriff straightened but didn't move, his hand resting near the butt of his revolver. Will took a step toward Ellie, his hand twitching toward Micah's blanket. Talon moved into the space between them without haste but with an unshakable presence, his height and breadth casting a shadow over them both. "You'll leave with your pride," Talon said, "or stay and lose more than that." The crowd held its breath. For a heartbeat, it looked as though Will might push through anyway, his jaw tight, his fists curling. But something in Talon's eyes, steady, unblinking, made him falter. His hand fell back to his side. "This isn't finished," Will muttered, stepping away, his voice stripped of the force it had carried moments ago. "No," Talon said evenly. "It isn't. But today, it ends this way." Will's gaze darted over the crowd, perhaps realizing how many pairs of eyes had just watched him back down. He turned abruptly and walked toward the saloon, his boots striking hard against the boards. The sheriff stayed where he was, but Ellie noticed the way his gaze followed Will until he was out of sight. The square loosened, murmurs rising again, but their tone had shifted. Some faces held surprise, others something closer to respect. Talon didn't look at the crowd. He looked at Ellie. "It's over for now," he said. She nodded, unable to trust her voice for a moment. Micah's small hand pressed against her collarbone, warm and solid. It was not a victory that would last forever, Ellie knew that. But it was a victory all the same. And for the first time in years, she had not bent. She had stood. And someone else had stood beside her. For a long moment after Will turned toward the saloon, the air in the square stayed taut, as if the dust itself were waiting to settle. Sheriff Klein, who had been leaning on the railing for most of the spectacle, finally pushed off it and stepped into the open. His boots made a slow, deliberate path toward Ellie and Talon, but his eyes followed Will until the man was nearly to the swinging doors. "That's enough," the sheriff called, his voice carrying with an authority that hadn't been there before. "Caleb William Kane," using the full name like a verdict, "I've heard enough of what's been going on under your roof to call it what it is. A crime." The word hung there, heavier than any gossip the town had ever passed. Will froze, half turned toward the saloon, his shoulders drawing up tight. "You'll come with me," Klein continued, no room for argument in his tone. He stepped forward, taking hold of Will's arm, not roughly, but with the kind of grip a man doesn't shake off. A ripple went through the onlookers. The murmurs changed their shape, less like judgment, more like something unsettled, as if they were witnessing a shift they hadn't believed possible. Will glanced over his shoulder at Ellie. His eyes were a mix of disbelief and simmering rage, the look of a man who had always counted on the law to look the other way. This time, it hadn't. Klein turned him toward the jail, the crowd parting to make way. A few people stepped back without meaning to, as though brushing against something larger than themselves. The clink of spurs, the measured scrape of boots on boards, and then they were gone from sight. The square felt wider now, the space between Ellie and the gathered townsfolk no longer so sharp-edged. She could feel their eyes on her still, but the weight of it had changed. Some wary, some curious, a few almost respectful. Talon's gaze stayed on her, not the crowd. When he finally spoke, his voice was low enough that only she could hear it. "I only stood where you were already standing," he said. "The rest was yours." The words landed in her like a stone dropped in deep water, sending out slow, steady ripples. She thought of the lamp in the east window, unlit now but still there, and of the moccasins above the hearth. She thought of the way she had met Will's eyes in the square and not looked away. Ellie shifted Micah in her arms, his weight familiar, grounding. She turned from the center of the square and began to walk, her steps even, her chin level. Talon didn't follow, but she felt the steadiness of his presence in the space they'd shared. She left without hurry, her shadow stretching ahead of her in the late afternoon sun. For the first time in a long while, she was not walking away from something. She was walking toward whatever came next. The fire had burned low by the time Ellie laid Micah in his cradle. Above him, the two moccasins rested side by side on the narrow shelf, their soft leather glowing in the lamplight. The east window lamp sat unlit on the sill, its glass catching only the faint reflection of her face. She didn't need its flame tonight. The man who had answered it before was miles away, and the danger had passed. For now, the house was quiet, but it was not the brittle quiet of fear. It was a stillness she could shape, a room where her steps made the only echo, where the walls felt like they belonged to her again. Not safer exactly. Dry Creek hadn't changed, but the space inside her had. She moved to the window, looking out into the dark beyond the cottonwoods. Somewhere out there, coyotes would be calling, and the road would be carrying someone toward someplace else. She thought of Talon's steady eyes, of the square, of the moment she'd realized she was no longer waiting for someone else to speak for her. Some rescues come with noise, boots pounding, voices raised, the crash of a door thrown open. Others are quiet, just a shadow standing beside you until you remember you were meant to stand on your own. Both matter, but the second kind lingers longer. She turned back to Micah, sleeping under the quilt she'd sewn from scraps of her mother's dresses. The corridor she'd once felt open in the street was still with her, wider now, enough for both her and her son to walk through together when the time came. She banked the fire, the glow fading to embers. If stories like this stir your soul, subscribe now, share it with a friend, and tell us your thoughts in the comments.